Yeah, so I'm pretty close to having like a first cut at some of the DNS stuff. And as I'm kind of like building it, it kind of feels like it should be kind of like its own crate for a couple reasons. One, it's kind of a standalone thing and could be reusable outside of zTunnel. In addition, we really want this as a as we had discussed a few weeks back when we discussed the DNS stuff. We wanted the DNS feature to be a optional part of the build. You can certainly do that without making it a crate, but making it a crate kind of makes it a lot cleaner. It's also pretty idiomatic for Rust to do that sort of thing. However, currently we have, one crate for zTunnel, so it would take a little bit of restructuring. So I just kind of want to get people's thought on that.
I don't personally see any value, but I do see cost. So it may just be because I'm not a Rust expert, but why? What's the value? Like, I don't think we have a goal of zTunnel as a DNS library, and I'm not convinced that it's easier to make it optional, or that even optional compiling is a goal.
So, well, we actually discussed optional compiling as a goal when we discussed the DNS doc a few weeks back.
Yeah, so I don't agree with that goal though.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, we can have that discussion again, but it's I feel like having multiple crates is a pretty idiomatic Rust pattern, especially when they really are kind of independent libraries. I guess I don't see a lot of effort in doing this, and so I guess I'm surprised at the pushback. Can you maybe expand?
Yeah, if you want to make one crate, but then it needs to depend on some common field, then you need to make your common crate, and then you probably end up with a bunch of common utilities. So you have your utils crate, and suddenly we have 100 crates when they could just be imports. And like, there's no benefit to a user to make them crates, right? It seems like just more work for us and more complex. Go ahead, Kasim.
So my personal interest is, in making sure that zTunnel can be used as a library. So you can have a proxyless something where, you just link, you write a Rust application, you want to, reuse the same code, the same hbond, the same discovery service, and you just use Rust as a library with some API. And that would also allow people to take, to link zTunnel with the DNS server, with the CA or whatever they want to link it to.
Do you need individual components, or do you need one entry point to?
I'm not. I mean, one entry point is a minimum. Obviously, you need something. A bit more refined API, it's probably better, but not too big. But it doesn't have to be. Absolutely everything needs to be maintained as an API. But we should have the discipline. I'm not concerned about how many crates, but what is a stable interface, as minimal as necessary, which will allow, again, people to link different things in different ways and still benefit of the main functionality.
Yeah, I was kind of looking at it from the perspective of kind of layering functionality. Like zTunnel might be layered on top of something else that does DNS. Potentially that thing could leverage our DNS library, but neither zTunnel would need necessarily to include the code from DNS, and that other thing may not need to include the code from zTunnel. They could just share potentially the same code in that crate.
But it's about the same thing, Nate. I mean, as long as the functionality we have today in the core zTunnel is available and linkable as a library, then you can go nuts. I mean, you can put whatever you want. You have 1,000 options to build Z-tunnel based server that include anything without adding complexity or anything on the main Z-tunnel repo.
So are you for or against multiple crates? I'm not clear on that.
I am for one crate that can be imported by other applications. So if there are 2 or 3, I don't know. I mean, it's between you, John, and other people who know more Rust than I do.
Sure. Okay. Ian?
Excuse me. Could we meet this need by having one crate that has different features? So like proxy is a feature, DNS is a feature. If you don't accept the DNS feature, then it wouldn't be compiled into your binary.
Yeah. I think regardless, it would be a feature. Basically, I just see like, it's pretty clean in Rust to optionally even include another crate based on that feature, rather than having kind of like conditional compilation throughout an entire section of the code.
Ask why we want conditional compilation. We have 10,000 features in Easter today in one build. It's not clear why suddenly DNS and Z-tunnel needs its own build, and how someone's going to consume that anyways, because I really don't want to ship Z-tunnel FIPS, Z-tunnel non-FIPS, Z-tunnel FIPS DNS, Z-tunnel FIPS.
Yeah.
All these different, like we want one build, right?
Yeah, we wouldn't ship. We would ship one thing in open source, right? But if for folks that want to do custom builds, the feature's available. I mean, it's pretty low cost to us.
Well, we have to support it, maintain it.
Test it.
Yeah, test it.
I mean, what's the benefit? Like we shave off 200 kilobytes of code on a binary?
I don't actually know yet, so I'll have to see like what the binary ends up being.
Yeah, I mean, if it's like 80 megabytes or something ridiculous like that, or even 10, 20, I think it makes sense. But right now we don't have any data on that, so it seems premature.
And optimizing even 20 megs is not a huge deal. Compared with Sidecar, I don't think we are anywhere close. The big question is if we want to take the burden of maintaining a DNS server, or we want to let other vendors or projects to reuse the tunnel and link with DNS servers if they choose to. I mean, the question is, do we take the DNS maintenance and get in the business of being a DNS server, or do we, say it's not a core feature for Istio and let other people do it?
Well, I think the decision from a few weeks back was that we'll ship with our thing, but allow it to be stripped out, and in favor of reducing the size of the binary, and just deferring to platform for DNS, right?
Stripping the set of binary, I think it's optimizing for the wrong thing. Question is, do we believe that we should maintain a DNS server and document and everything else, or not? If we decide that it's worth being a DNS server, we should just compile it in and be part of the normal distribution and bite the bullet.
Right. Is there a stronger requirement here about being able to swap out the DNS with a different DNS implementation?
Yes, that was yeah. We wanted to basically allow the platform to provide DNS.
But not in the binary, right?
But not in the binary. That's a little different than swapping out the implementation inside, like a custom build of Z-tunnel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I misunderstood what you were asking. No, I don't think we're going to slip or replace anything within Z-tunnel. So it's not like an API kind of thing.
Yeah. And that just sounds more like an option in Z-tunnel itself.
Yes, right. It would be a build feature.
A flag.
Yeah.
A build feature or a runtime flag?
I mean, could be either.
I mean, it's a good debate to have, actually. I don't know what the idioms are for Rust in this, but traditionally this would have been dealt with by a flag, right? It's like.
So this has been an issue that we dealt with, Louis, a little bit in your absence. There had been a proposal I believe it was from Solo, to add like WebAssembly style extensibility into ztunnel.
Oh, yeah.
The response at the time was like, Rust is really composable. Go ahead and have your own build rather than, you know, dragging down everyone's open source build by adding features there.
Right.
I think that using multiple crates would support that sort of a model that we want Solo and others to follow, where instead of adding extensibility into Istio, they consume the bits that they need and modify them as needed. Nate, is that what this is going towards?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair.
The Solo thing was a little different in that it was, I think, making ztunnel a crate that could be composed so that you could add like extensions to the network handling pathway, as opposed to the DNS stuff, which is essentially a wholly separate bit of logic, right? And I think actually it's even stronger for the DNS stuff. The case is stronger to just say, yeah, it should be a separate crate, and doing it as a feature flag. Like that seems pretty reasonable as a starting point from like a Rust canonical perspective, like a build flag that toggles, you know, the feature is a build flag, toggles the include of a crate or not. We go from there. That doesn't seem terrible to me.
Yeah, I think the DNS thing is a pretty good example of a standalone library. I don't know if we have a lot of other examples of that today in ztunnel.
We don't, yeah.
But I mean, it is pretty
Maybe crypto,
idiomatic in Rust to make separate standalone libraries crates. You know, it's just kind of pretty common. You look at a lot of projects out there, and they're just, you know,
yeah,
multi-crate projects.
This would feel a lot weirder to me if it was not a crate, right? If this was a proposal, it's like we're going to add a DNS server and it's not its own crate, at least that would be a little weird. Like whether it's
exactly
free or not, I don't necessarily care at this point. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, John, to your kind of concern about crate proliferation, I don't know we need to worry about that too much. I mean, I think it's going to come up on a, you know, PR by PR basis. Somebody tries to add a new crate, we can say, does it really make sense as a crate? Yada yada yada. You know, I think we can get a handle.
That's what I'm trying to do right now. Is hey, does this make sense? And I don't. It, like we're saying, we should turn one crate into 4 or 5 crates. But there's no benefit. There's just complexity. Like I don't see why. That's what I haven't heard.
I guess I don't really understand how it's complex. I mean, it's like separating out a library into a separate crate is pretty idiomatic. It's not like it's not in my opinion adding complexity. It just,
why not just make it another module instead of a crate though? Then we don't have to make so many different crates, which by the way, each crate specifies its dependencies. So we're going to have like 10 crates, sorry, maybe not 10, we'll say 5 crates depending on Tokyo. And then you need to make sure that doesn't go awry. And every time you import one library, you need to go modify the crates dependencies. Like we have dependencies at the binary level. We don't really care about them at a per crate level. You can have clean code and separate isolation with modules that's not needed in crates. Like I get that other projects do it, but they have different needs, I think. Like we're talking things like Servo or something that's like 1 million lines of code. It makes much more sense to have small crates in that case than a very focused small binary. Like we have all of Istio with one Go module, for example.
Well, so coming back to use cases, right? Like, is there anyone else who would want to take a dependency on our DNS crate?
I suspect we would.
But outside of us, right? Like
which
John's
we
argument.
understand, yeah. By the way,
Right,
by the way, Ben was mentioning about Solo submitted a PR to extend ztunnel. At this stage, I don't really see how we could leverage multiple crates to help us at this moment.
Wait, Nate, so you're saying you want to import ztunnel DNS into some other Rust project that's outside of Istio?
Possibly. It's notional at this point.
But how is it configured? Like, is it still configured over XDS?
Also possibly. I don't know. But that's I mean, that actually brings up another point. Like our XDS protos could be made into a crate. I mean, that seems pretty reasonable.
I mean, they're protobufs, so.
For context, one of the ways to justify contributing to open source as a company is that your company has an interest in the component you're developing and the ability to reuse it. And that's
like if there's a reasonable use case where reusing some of the component parts of zTunnel in a different project makes sense, like that's a perfectly valid use case.
I would agree with that as well. But wait, the hypothetical future, maybe we'll want to depend on it, because we don't know what you'll want to depend on, right? We maybe divided the crates up in the wrong way. Like, we can still write clean code that's isolated without making a bunch of crates by using modules, and then we're not locked into anything. Like, we can always refactor things later. Now, if you go write terrible code now, it's probably harder, but I'm sure that we'll write, we'll have a DNS module.
All of Nate's code is terrible.
Plus one to that.
Right. So I guess there's two issues, right, with any like componentization, right? One is the interfaces, and then two is the modularization of the build of dependency artifacts. I am no Rust expert on either of those things. I probably have a bit more experience with the interfaces than the modules part. If you're trying to do this right now, Nate, then right, obviously there's two choices, right? You can either depend on all of zTunnel, right, and an interface, or you can depend on a piece of zTunnel in a crate and an interface, right? And you're going to deal with the churn in either. Is it substantially better one way or the other right now? I presume the interface is more material anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so are you asking, like, is it a burden to take on the full binary size of all of zTunnel?
Yeah.
I don't know. It just seems kind of icky to do such a thing, right? Because it is really a separate thing. It should just be, a handful of files. It really is a standalone entity. It was that case in Istio too, in Golang. But it's I feel like dividing things up into crates is more idiomatic sort of thing to do in Rust. It's just it seems to make sense to do that. I think the only thing, John, that you're saying that might resonate is the fact that each crate kind of needs its own listed dependencies. I mean, I suppose we can look into ways of simplifying that so that we know that dependencies are consistent across all the crates. But is that really the main issue? I mean, apart from
concern, that, I think I would actually be a lot less concerned if the crates were I don't know if this is a real term, but kind of leaf crates. Like, if it's just a completely standalone thing that is just doing some logic that doesn't depend on anything, that's fine. But if we get in the situation where that thing is kind of in the middle of the dependency tree, and it kind of, zTunnel depends on it, but it depends on some things in zTunnel, like the XDS objects or things like that, or logging libraries, all this different stuff, then it becomes hairy, because now you have this whole complicated kind of tree of crates.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. If we would want to just make this a standalone, it does not depend backwards in any way.
Yeah, my assumption though was that it would have to, because it should be reading from the XDS.
Right, and I think the XDS part could be ripped out of it and put into the zTunnel proper code for now.
Yeah, so I think for me, when it comes to extensibility, the prospect of being able to just import the XCS library or the DNS libraries is pretty attractive. The weird thing about doing that for zTunnel now is that and that's where the discussion was a few months ago, right? Is that where are the integration points going to be, and are those going to be sufficient for the use cases? Whereas I think having, I agree with John here, if they're pure leaf crates that just have the standalone functionality of DNS or Istio compatible XDS, Those are pieces that can be composed in a not awful way. And the actual kind of reference implementation that we know today as eTunnel doesn't have to worry about exposing all these 100 different integration points for people to do custom stuff. They can just leverage the library. And if the library wants to have, or reference a crate, and the crate can have whatever integration points make sense for standalone. That seems reasonable to me.
Right. I just think so. I think it's reasonable. I think the one thing people taking dependencies have to realize is that, right, this work and meeting the requirements of the interfaces will be done to serve zTunnel, right? And so if those interfaces churn, right, the downstream adopters will have to adapt, right? Don't consider them to be hard contractual stable APIs, right? You're not, right? This is library dependency without a contract.
Yeah, definite +1.
Agreed.
So, John and anyone who's interested, I'm happy to kind of start a work in progress PR in the next week or so, and we can just have the discussion there if that works.
Yeah, I think doing it with real code is probably a bit more conducive as well. It's easy to say it will be simple or it will be complicated in the abstract.
Yeah, also give us a way to iterate on, see what it takes. Like if there are improvements that can be made to keep it as simple as possible, then doing that in the PR seems most practical. I do think we want to facilitate this though, John, right? Like in general, right? The granularity is still probably subject to TPD, and right, the downstream dependency takers have to deal with churn, but I see no reason not to facilitate people recomposing zTunnel-like things out of zTunnel's component parts. Right, as long as it doesn't impose any undue stress on upstream, right? So upstream and zTunnel get to iterate as they see fit.
If we're in agreement on that, would an initial PR where I restructure zTunnel to have a single crate of zTunnel nested inside it be reasonable as a starting point?
Rust experts.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting do something essentially like what that 253 PR does, where zTunnel is consumed as a crate, basically? The one I linked in chat, right, where there's just a zTunnel crate that is wrapped with some sort of invocation. Is that what you're talking about doing?
I did not see that link.
Okay, well, there's two parts to that, but one is basically treat zTunnel as a Rust component itself, and then there's the extension stuff. But I think the Rust treat zTunnel as a component is what you're talking about, essentially, like make it a importable module.
Yeah, well, I was actually just going to take basically all the code and everything and just put it into a subdirectory, so it'd be effectively zTunnel/zTunnel.
Yep.
And then have a workspace. The TOML at the top level would just be a workspace that includes it. So it would effectively be a no op apart from just restructuring.
Okay. I mean, yeah, it seems reasonable to me to start the PR with that. We can look at it and see what it actually looks like in practice.
Okay. I'll send something out in the next day or two. Thanks, guys.
All right. Keith, I think your agenda item is up next.
Yeah, this is me looking to try to push on some of the stuff in Linux Live Ambient to beta doc. One of the P0 items is peer authentication and figuring out what support looks like for that in Ambient. Looking at the Ambient APIs doc, there's kind of two paths forward. One to keep peer auth in and kind of retrofit semantics on top of it to make sure it makes sense in Ambient. The other one is to rip it out completely and use authorization policy kind of as a replacement. Wanted to see where consensus is on this because I couldn't find any. I reached out to a couple of folks individually about it. I think my preference would probably be for Ambient Beta to just continue using peer auth in, but I think I'm generally aligned long term with perhaps with making augmentation policy do the same job. But regardless, yeah, I just want to see if there's direction here, and if so, would love to make a general issue and start going through what implementation looks like.
I mean, I'm probably the one that objected the most on this and argued with John quite a bit. My personal opinion was that it's not our business to deal with plain text in Ambient. Network policy exists. It's a very good API in Kubernetes. It can be used to restrict and fine tune exactly what you want to be allowed as plain text or not from non-Istio workloads. So it's better to just get out of the way and have an option to not capture plain text and let network policy deal with it. And we are focused only on the strict TLS. So if you have a legacy, VM or something that needs to talk with a workload and needs to use plain text, you can put a network policy and allow it to do it. Otherwise, you can deny all traffic to the plain text.
I hear that. I can say with OSM, we kind of did a similar thing where we didn't allow plain text or any kind of protocol detection mechanism, and there were some customers were kind of confused, and it made adoption a bit longer, just because I have to have a certificate to talk to this thing, and it makes the dependency chain a lot further because you have to figure out who talks to what service before like setting on your config, which is probably the most secure thing, but adoption wise it is difficult. We talked about this on a different PR, but there's kind of two main personas to keep in mind with Ambient: the Istio classic to Ambient migration and the Kubernetes to Ambient migration. The network policy approach that you're suggesting, Cox, feels very geared toward a natural for the K8 to Ambient migration path, but fairly disruptive, in my opinion, to the Istio to Ambient path. Go ahead.
I don't think it has any impact for Istio. Istio is always going to be using the TLS port and should never. I cannot imagine any case where an Istio with Sidecar or whatever will use the plain text port. By definition, if it's an Istio workload, it will use a. John, am I wrong?
I think, this is still in debate, but kind of the current thinking was that for ztunnel network policy, we want the network policy to apply before tunneling or after detunneling. So it would be on the original port, not on the H1 port, which is not how sidecars would work with Hbone and not compatible with your thinking for how network policy should work. That's not decided fully, I guess, but that's kind of been where the thinking has been going currently.
So you're saying that if network policy is implemented in ztunnel and we intercept and we bypass the network policy with interceptions, then it's not possible to use network policy. That's what you're saying?
No, we'll use the CNI network policy. It will just apply on the traffic. Like we can decide when it applies, right? It can apply before we put it in Hbone tunnel or after. So the original port or 15,008.
I see. Yeah, but my concern is for network policy to be respected. So if someone relies on network policy, it should do what it's expected to do. So if I say that a workload that is not using Istio can talk plain text with a workload that is using Istio, I should be able to express it to network policy. Is this true?
Are you expressing it based on an assumption that 15,008 is TLS, or you're just saying pod A can't talk to pod B?
Pod A can talk with pod B.
Oh yeah, that should be fine. I completely agree. But this is about whether they can talk over plain text or TLS or either. Right, it's kind of orthogonal.
I see.
And network policy doesn't directly address whether the traffic is plain text, right? We could just implicitly address it through port number, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that was the thinking that the port number is explicit, and if you use network policy with port and port equal 8080, that implies that you allow access to port 8080. If you say and port, ztunnel port, then it's implicit that it's ztunnel allowed.
Okay.
So with normal network policy and layered, network policy applies first, and you talk with port, then it will work perfectly fine. But I understand the complexity that John described.
Yeah, so what benefit do we gain by dropping PO authentication? Because to me, I feel like it's just, first of all, user come from sidecar world, right? It's a learning curve for them if we drop it. Oh, you don't support PO authentication now? By the way, we've been using it for a long time. And to me, I think PO authentication has been extremely helpful in the sidecar world to help people troubleshooting, right? To enable strict was not strict when their application have complex compatibility issues with sidecar. It has been extremely useful for onboarding applications with sidecar. So,
well, permissive mode doesn't make sense anymore. That's one thing.
well,
Because
from out of mesh to in mesh, right? Like Keith was saying earlier.
I don't think that peer authentication. Oh, sorry, I thought you were done. Lynn.
Go
Sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't know that peer authentication doesn't make sense in Ambient. I think peer authentication is a declarative expression of user intent of what kind of encryption to use. And in sidecar case, it's doing one thing, but in Ambient case, it's just port numbers. I don't think that we should elevate specific HTML port numbers to the user that feels like a leaky abstraction at that point. It's just, in my mind, port numbers are implementation details of user declared intent.
Right. So I mean, all peer authentication does is it says whether to allow plain text or MTLS traffic to a workload.
Keep in mind that we had a discussion very similar, that peer authentication really doesn't do anything. I mean, it's like the using service entries for egress control. It's a very weak security boundary. Even if you say strict, what it really means is that pretty much everyone has access, because everyone in the mesh can get a certificate trivially. Proper way to do security is to put an authorization policies where you say that this workload can only be accessed by Alice and Bob, and then you are controlling who can talk with you. If you say that the entire cluster can talk with me if only they use the MTLS certificates that they can get trivially, you don't gain much really, and it's also easy to bypass in some ways. And
to me, though, like, I think it's a very valid argument, and I would probably completely agree with it if this was a new API being proposed. But I think the biggest risk is that a user adopts Ambient, they stick peer authentication strict, they think all their traffic's TLS, but it's actually not. And it is in some cases. For sidecars it is, but not for a ztunnel. That would be my concern. And we don't have a good way to expose that to users. Now, I suppose you could say that for every other API as well, like request authentication or envoy filter, I don't know. So maybe it's a bit of an unfair argument, but that would be my biggest concern. Is it just the confusion that migrating users may have?
Can we restrict it to exactly what you said? I mean, if we see peer authentication strict, we deny all traffic on plain text, but we don't support any other field, like.
Oh, that was the proposal.
To only, if we see strict for a particular workload, you only do strict for that workload. So no plain text.
Oh yeah, there was never. Yeah, sorry. In the API proposal, we said we would never do plain text, even if they say.
Okay, I can live with that. As a global setting or as a per workload?
I think we keep it as the same same global namespace workload selector like the API is. Like, I think how we would implement this is Istio-D would translate it to authorization policies in ztunnel. Ztunnel shouldn't need any changes. It should be purely control plane side.
For migration, I don't mind. I mean, I'm just my concern is it's really not a very good practice to. So if you want to limit what I mean, the network policy had the benefits that you can fine tune what is allowed to go into the pod. So if you may have a legacy workload and you can fine tune that particular workload is allowed to do plain text instead of binary switch everything on or off. But that's fine. I mean, if it's if we just support it for migration, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, network policy can't actually say it's TLS or not. It can only say it's on the port that is probably TLS, right? So,
but can achieve the.
But
fine
authorization
tuning.
policy, you can do what you really want is authorization policy, right? You say, I want this identity, then it's doing a proper check.
That's the problem. You cannot do it with authorization policy because if you put authorization policies, then you cannot say authorize for everyone except for this particular workload where I allow plain text. So basically, kind of, if you have let's say you have a legacy gateway, like in Google, you have the load balancers. You want those particular by CIDR or by something to be allowed in and be kind of trusted implicitly because they're in different CIDR. That's a use case that is not possible.
Is that a use case we want that?
It's a use case we have at Google, and probably others have similar use cases.
Yeah. No, but actually you could, right? Because you could say either it's this identity or it's this CIDR as a source. Isn't that supported in Nazi policy?
I don't think so. Maybe.
You can do ORs like that. Go ahead, Louis.
So how do we plan to get plain text traffic into ztunnel so we could enforce a policy?
We are already doing this. We capture the inbound traffic to the.
Okay, so really what we're saying is this is a CNI option, right? That controls whether the CNI captures all inbound or just the tunnel inbound.
I mean, we could say that. That's not what.
I know it's not what.
Yeah.
But that's actually what's happening, right?
Maybe, but I mean, no.
I
mean,
don't,
well, I don't know.
I don't think any
Like-
sane CNI will have an option to, hey, don't encrypt some traffic. All CNIs I know either they don't support encryption or they encrypt everything. So
It's not a no-op to have ztunnel capture the plain text traffic. You can have a policy that allows certain sliders or something, an authorization policy, or with the
Right, so
telemetry and whatnot. So
The reason why we're doing all the capture is so we can have policy on it.
yeah.
on things that we should not interfere with because, again, Ambient is supposed to be encrypted all the time, and either use Ambient and then there is no need to capture the inbound at all.
Right, so you turn it off.
Yeah, I mean, the entire inbound capture should be useless. I mean, if we had proper pilot tells the client the address of ztunnel, there will be absolutely no need for any capture at all for Ambient.
No, but if the pilot's telling the clients, then they're not going to do plain text. Oh, you're saying that's fine. We only care about.
So we made a choice early on that Istio-D, it's giving the address of the pod.
Yeah. So
and the ztunnel port. If we did delegation where you just give the node address and you encode it, then the entire inbound capture and all the other discussion will be completely moot. I mean, it'll be just.
But then we can't capture plain text traffic.
And if everything is encrypted anyway automatically, why would we capture it? I mean, we'd let network policy deal with any potential plain text traffic, which shouldn't exist in the first place in an ambient network. So exceptions will be exceptions controlled by network policy, and we are not involved. That simplifies a lot. Anyway, it's too late for that probably, but.
Okay, so go ahead, Keith.
No, I think you were going to wrap it up or add something. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think if we say we want ztunnel to capture and see plain text traffic so we can enforce policy on it, then we need, right, all we're doing is translating pure authentication policy into authorization policy and extending the capability of authorization policy to say plain text or not, right? Allow, deny.
I don't think we need to extend the capabilities. I think you can say like principal is star or something, and it's the same thing. Or you might want cluster. You might want to specify the trust domain. Probably want to specify the trust domain. I think that's how we do it in an Envoy equivalent.
Yeah, I think that's probably good enough to start with, whether we've identified peers or not. At some point, we may need to be able to distinguish on the mechanism, but probably not to start with.
And again, I think I'm fine on the long tail of this being deprecating or moving away from peer authentication because we can express it in authentication policy. But for the sake of the ambient to beta and adoption transition, I think it makes sense for the Istio classic to ambient users to have their stuff still work in a fairly expected way.
Right, so we should just put the deprecation note in the API, point them to how this would work with an equivalent authorization policy, and that's what we would release.
If there's a path to deprecation, I'm happy. I mean, my concerns started with the idea that eventually zTunnel should be part of CNI layer anyway, somehow. And anything like peer authentication, it's delaying this from happening because it's more APIs, more surfaces that such a CNI layer would need to support. But if it's just transitory and eventually it's not something, a core API that is going to be required by a native ambient implementations, and it's perfectly fine.
Okay. So it's kind of like a conditional deprecation, right?
But I wonder if we should even message the deprecation until zTunnel becomes the CNI. Else we would just be confused user a lot.
Well, as long as we're telling them what to do, right, and the thing that they would replace it with is just an existing API that's already there, right? That should be satisfactory then, right? It's just it's a one less API for them to look at.
Okay, just use the auth policy instead.
Yeah. And that works for sidecar too, right?
Yeah, I have a question, right? So if the direction is to move the peer authentication into authorization policy, how do we convey this concept of this must be encrypted by MTLS? Because authorization policy essentially is expressing who is allowed to do what operation on what resource, but not this who, right? May come from JOT, may come from certificate, and they may come from plain text. It's not about the transportation layer. The TLS is the transportation layer security. So it's not, conceptually not part of authorization policy. So I just want to, get to the...
Well, we have two types of principles, right? There's request principle and peer principle. The only way we distribute peer principle today is with a secure overlay, right? HBone or MTLS, right? So if we have a requirement that there's a securely identified peer principle, right, that gets us 99% of that. The second part, as I mentioned earlier, is describing the mechanism. It's not clear if we need to do that yet, right? We could say, was this done over TLS 1.3 using this cipher, right? We could add those additional layers if they became necessary, but it seems premature to add them.
Okay, so essentially what we are saying is, if we have authorization policy, then it means the traffic is encrypted. If you are using plain text, essentially you are not, the authorization policy is bypassed because all the...
No, not the policy. The policy has a check that says, is there a peer principle or not? If there's no peer principle, the traffic could be plain text. right? It's not, there's no identifiable peer.
But if
You know-
there is a peer principle, but it's the traffic is plain text, so the attacker can.
How would there be a peer principle?
Let's say you send a job, but it's
That's
not.
not a, that's a request. That's a request principle, not a peer principle.
Yeah, peer principle is a peer certificate. So peer authentication is equivalent with authorization with peer certificate star. So if you allow from anyone, that's exactly the same thing.
So Qua has a reasonable question like that we need to think about with connect job, but I still think that's request principle, not peer principle. Right? We have to look at the properties, right, to see if this actually holds, but
Just one small note. It's actually not checking that there's any identity. It does check the trust domain. And the other thing is someone mentioned that this equivalent, it's very close to equivalent, but I think with pure authentication, we'll actually deny it in the TLS handshake. With authorization policy, we'll fully accept the TLS handshake or lack thereof and then deny it. I guess it's actually, this ends up being the same because there's no TLS handshake if you're doing plain text.
And it's a,
So maybe it is the same.
the effect is the same. And
Yeah.
I think we need to be very careful with this. It must be MTLS, or maybe, in Google is LOAS. Maybe it's a different protocol that is equivalent with MTLS and provides the same characteristics. I mean, it doesn't have to be strictly, maybe it's, I don't know.
Yeah, but both authorization policy and pure
Yeah.
authentication provide that, right? Both of them are just talking about, well, maybe we say MTLS in there when we shouldn't, but it's really
No,
just
but
saying,
on Quad's comment about the connect jot, I mean, if connect jot is enabled, then the admin believes that it's equivalent from their security posture perspective, then it's a peer certificate. It can be treated the same as a certificate. That was my point.
yeah, actually looking at it, pure authentication does specifically say MTLS, but if we really need to, we could probably say MTLS equivalent or something to, but I mean, that's also another thing that's in favor of authorization policy, right? It doesn't specify the transport. It just says that identity. I'll just say pure certificate. So, but that's, we could genericize the wording to make it fit other use cases.
Does that mean that the default authorization allows plain text or not doesn't allow plain text? I'm still not.
Does allow plain text.
So that means everyone has to write an authorization policy to disallow plain text?
or the admin
If
does.
they want to, yeah.
So that means we have inheritance of authorization policies too, or?
Yeah, that's already in the API.
That's the same as with PRauthn right now, right? You have to create one to set strict everywhere.
Yep, which you usually don't do because it breaks a lot of things.
Is the current behavior of the alpha release going to be documented when we release it?
That's a good, but what is the current behavior of the alpha release? Is it just ignore it?
Yeah, there's no pure authentication. I don't think we probably don't document. That's my guess.
I don't think we would have time to document because the release goes out in 2 days, 3 days. Yeah. But it's good to
Ambient
document for the
usage guide
next one.
says this page is under construction. So no, we don't document what is supported and what's not. Well, we document what is supported, and then
Right.
you could imply that the rest is unsupported, but it probably
Release day of the
Implicit.
31st, is that right?
So next Wednesday.
Okay, next Wednesday.
I'm just thinking, we've already had one user discover this and be surprised by it. We're asking all of our users to kick the tires and let us know what needs improvement. It might be a good idea to have a way of letting them know where we already know there needs improvement so that we don't get inundated with bug reports on this.
You could, there is that section, or there was that section on the experimental ambient branch of like, here is what we know breaks. Did that ever get migrated somewhere that we could update?
Well, I don't think we can do it without fixing some stuff. Like we did authentication separately because otherwise Envoy starts doing work, and that tends to explode faster than just denying plain text. Are we gonna also fix Envoy to not do that, or?
No, we can continue to configure Envoy to deny plain text if there is any authorization policy, no?
But that means you have to reason about authorization policy. It means you have to start figuring out whether authorization policy implies plain text allowed or not.
Is there any authorization policy that does not imply plain text? I mean, even with JOTs must be sent over. Ah, I see what you're saying, that we kind of violate the standard. And yeah, that's a good point.
Did we say we were getting rid of pure authentication at some point that I missed, or are we just saying we're going to push users to use authorization policy and then they'll run into these issues?
I think we were going to soft deprecate it, right?
Okay, so it will be there and implemented in Z10. We just will push users to other things. And
I think we said we are not going to promote it to V1. That was the only thing, which is a soft deprecation.
To stable, we're not promoted, right?
Yeah, not promote to stable and kind of soft,
Yeah.
but still supported.
Yeah, that's fair.
yeah, to Quad's point, I think, I mean, ignoring time and complexity, it seems like the best thing to do would be fix it in Envoy, transform it in control plane so that we set the same thing, or do nothing and decreasing order preference. But I don't know how feasible either of those two are.
I worry about any reasoning done on authorization policy. That's a risk because now you have
Yeah,
to.
I do as well.
But where is this Envoy that we are talking about? So the waypoint receives HBON, which is clearly plain, TLS, and that's it, because cTunnel is the one that receives that to reinforce the peer authentication. Where would we have
there is
Envoy
still
accepting
applied
plain text?
Envoy. I mean, this authorization policy for HTTP at least is done by Envoy too, right? So it has
No,
to be
but
every client, not just
where would peer authentication be applied in Envoy? Because there is no sidecar, so there is just zTunnel doing what peer authentication was doing, and the waypoint will never have plain text.
Sidecars up.
We still have sidecars. I mean, this stuff is not just ambient specific API, right? It's a global change.
No, we are not touching anything on sidecar. I mean, whatever works in sidecar, it's cast in stone and.
Yeah, but we tell users to use authorization policy instead of peer authentication now. So the code hasn't changed, but the user's patterns have changed, right?
Yeah, but we also tell them to move to Ambient, so it's a short-term problem.
I mean, that's more about, I mean, you can have a separate of Z for ambient, then it's easy. But if you have shared of Z, they should mean the same thing, right?
That's a very good point. We actually do have a different Z for zTunnel. So we are already telling them to use, I mean, we may tell them for zTunnel, you have to use the new Z authorization policy anyway. I don't know.
I missed that last question. Was it, what, can you repeat that, Quat?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
I didn't hear what you just previously said. What was the suggestion?
Well, if we're gonna change the meaning of authorization, that will have a performance impact on sidecars, because now we'll have to do authorization without authentication, and that's expensive.
Can we defer this, the soft deprecation into later? Because it seems that we know what we want to do for ambient specifically. What we're not sure about is how I want to reconcile that with sidecars. So does it make sense to delay the soft deprecation, or do you have to do it?
Well, I don't know if we need to delay the soft deprecation doesn't say like this is going away anytime soon, right? So What is the concern that people will just start writing auth-z policies to deny plain text traffic and have sidecars implement that while having, pure auth-n policy be permissive?
My concern is just not to leave sidecars alone, and we change auth-z by implying that now it has to be applied to plain text, which I think is a proposal, but that has performance implication. I'm fine if we just have different auth-z's. It's just,
why is auth-z not applied to plain text traffic in the sidecar?
because peer authentication will just not listen on the plain text. It just immediately deny non-TLS traffic.
Sure, but like the auth-z would still apply if the plain text traffic was accepted if permissive was set.
Right, but with this change, that means everything has to accept plain text and possibly deny it, right? Which is different thing, which is...
Yeah, no, it definitely has a performance impact. I agree with that, right? Like
For
we'll end up
case.
parsing the protocol.
it
Even
has
if we're
actually, yeah, it's larger than that. It's like, at least for TCP, there's a problem that it also connects to upstream before finishing auth-z. So it's doing a lot more work.
It connects to upstream before completing auth-z.
Yeah, that's how Istio works for TCP.
And starts writing data from the server to the
Oh
client.
God.
But that's pretty rare. It's on the
But
server.
what is also rare is to have a production system where a huge amount of traffic is rejected. So it's not common to,
Right.
so we optimize for the normal 90% of the traffic, which is 200 and works. It's not, a significant amount of traffic in a production cluster that will be rejected immediately, and we optimize for it.
I think I agree with that. Like it does make sense to say, hey, if you're dealing with performance issues, have authorization policy that is stricter, and you can start limiting things.
Yeah, it seems
With
like
the
it's still.
performance,
Go ahead, Lynn.
well, with the performance issue, I don't think I'm very comfortable about the software deprecating now, because it's very confusing if we can send the user different messages for Ambient and sidecar.
Right, but I think we're saying that in the typical case, there isn't a performance issue. Right, if you're 90% of traffic is traffic you're going to deny, there's something inherently wrong in your system anyway. Right, it's an exceptional case. It probably means that you're trying to respond to an incident. Right, and performance is probably not your primary concern at that point.
Okay.
Like, what production system is in steady state rejecting most of its traffic? Right, and the
So
fact
this only-
actually that we deny the traffic just on the handshake, which means we don't get protocol level information in the logs or traces about it, can actually be a problem to go and diagnose what's going wrong. So like it's different. It's a change in behavior, but I don't think it's a regression. If we could think of a reason why it was a major functional regression. Now, the situation that Kwok mentioned where we're sending TCP traffic prior to auth-z completing, right? That's a bug, right? Like if auth-z isn't completed before first byte is sent or received, right, we have a big problem. But that's the case today already. So, right, with auth-z, right, it's independent of permissive restrict. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Trying to drop as well, but it sounds like there's not a blocker as far as the actual implementation of PRauth, just around the messaging to users, given some of the performance issues. Is that a fair summary? Potential performance issues, I should say. Okay.
Right. And we can also do the API thing of like allowing people to deny, right, define the mechanism, and then we can interpret that to be early reject of the TLS handshake, right? Still simplify the API surface, but maintain the existing behavior. Right? That's just an interpretation.
Cool, sounds good. I'll get started creating issues and stuff on implementation. But I gotta drop. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Cool. Is that a status, like that last part? Right. If we really need to recover the existing behavior completely, we can add an interpretation of authorization policy, which is just deny where MTLS is false, right?
Hot has dropped. Wait.
Oh, yes. Okay. Slackers. I should have dropped it. This meeting has run over. I'll shut
Yeah.
up. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.